A quiet stroll gone wrong. On a crisp autumn morning, the sun was a soft golden hue, casting a warm glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood where Ilani Roberts lived. The trees, rich with shades of amber, gold, and russet, whispered gently in the breeze, their leaves falling like confetti around her as she slowly made her way down the sidewalk in her wheelchair. She had lived in this neighborhood for nearly 30 years, and the familiar sights of the cozy homes, neatly trimmed lawns, and smiling faces always brought her comfort. Ilani was a woman who had seen many seasons of life. Now, at 65, her body had begun to show signs of the years she had lived, her hands were shaky, and her joints ached with every movement. But she had lived through so much, a marriage that had ended in loss, the raising of her son, Alan, and countless moments of joy, sorrow, and triumph. Despite her health issues, particularly her asthma, Ilani was determined to live life to the fullest. She had always been independent, and even now, she enjoyed these quiet moments when she could feel the sun on her skin and the gentle wind in her hair. She had planned on just taking a short stroll down her block, a small break from her routine, before heading back home. The weather was perfect for it, bright, yet not too hot, with a slight chill in the air. The air itself was clean and fresh, the kind of morning Ilani had always appreciated. As she wheeled herself along, she noticed a few children riding their bikes, waving as they passed, and a couple of neighbors tending to their gardens. Life, as usual, felt normal. But just as she neared the end of the block, she felt it, the familiar tightness in her chest. At first, she thought it was nothing, perhaps just the air being a little drier than usual, or maybe she was just tired. But within seconds, the tightness in her chest intensified, and her breath became shallow, sharp. The weight in her lungs made it difficult to breathe, and she knew, with growing panic, that it was an asthma attack. Ilani had been dealing with asthma for most of her life. She knew the signs. She had her inhaler with her, tucked safely in her bag. The problem, however, was that her hands were shaking too much to reach inside the bag. She could feel her pulse racing, each heartbeat thudding in her ears as she tried to steady her hands. But they trembled uncontrollably, and as she searched frantically for the inhaler, her vision began to blur, each passing second seeming to stretch into eternity. The bag slipped from her lap and hit the ground, spilling its contents into the street. Her keys, a small bottle of water, her wallet, a folded photo of her late husband, everything scattered around her. It was as though the world was slowly fading away, and she was helpless to stop it. Her breath became more erratic, her chest constricting. She had to get that inhaler. Desperation set in as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the scattered items on the ground, but nothing was close enough. She tried to bend over to retrieve them, but her frail body wasn't cooperating. Her legs felt weak, and as she leaned forward, the sudden dizziness overtook her, causing her to lose balance. She felt herself sliding off the chair and hitting the pavement with a thud. The world around her seemed to spin, and she could hear the sound of her own labored breathing echoing in her ears. "Help, help me!" Ilani gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to push herself up, but her strength was fading fast. "Please. I can't breathe." At that moment, a figure appeared in the distance. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and through her fogged vision, she could make out the silhouette of a police officer approaching. Relief washed over her for a moment. Finally, someone was coming to help. But as the figure drew closer, something didn't feel right. Officer Cole, a 40-year-old white man, had been patrolling the neighborhood when he spotted Ilani on the ground. From a distance, he had assumed she was just another elderly person struggling. But as he got closer and saw her desperate attempts to breathe, a look of irritation crossed his face. He slowed his steps, glancing down at her with a mixture of indifference and annoyance. Ilani's eyes were still blurry, but she could make out the officer's uniform and the cold, calculating look in his eyes. "Please, officer," she wheezed, her voice trembling with fear. "I need my inhaler, please help me." Instead of offering assistance, Officer Cole's eyes locked onto the bag that had fallen onto the pavement. He glanced at the inhaler, and without hesitation, he picked it up. Ilani's heart sank. "No, no," she gasped, barely able to speak. With a casual flick of his wrist, Officer Cole tossed the inhaler into the nearby trash can. "Look at this," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just another junkie, huh?" Ilani's mind was reeling. She couldn't process what was happening. The officer had just taken away her only means of survival. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to grab the inhaler. But it was too late. Officer Cole, clearly entertained by her struggle, walked away, his footsteps growing fainter with each passing moment. "Please," Ilani begged, her voice breaking as she slumped helplessly to the ground. She was desperate, but there was no one around to help. The officer was gone, and she was alone. As she lay there, gasping for breath, her vision fading to black, she could barely make out the sound of approaching footsteps, this time, a familiar voice. "Mom! Mom!" Alan's voice rang out, full of fear. Alan, her son, had been on his way home from a nearby store when he saw her lying on the ground, struggling to breathe. His heart dropped into his stomach as he rushed to her side, scooping her up as best as he could, his hands shaking. "Mom, hold on," he cried, panic in his voice. He could feel her body trembling in his arms, her breath coming in sharp gasps. With the strength of sheer will, Alan lifted her into his arms and carried her to the car, driving as fast as he could to the hospital. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What had happened? Why had the officer been so cruel? Why hadn't he helped her? The hospital staff took over immediately when they arrived. Ilani was hooked up to oxygen and given a series of medications to stabilize her. Alan didn't leave her side for hours, pacing anxiously in the waiting room until the doctors came out to give him an update. The moment they told him his mother was going to be okay, a wave of relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by anger. How could anyone be so heartless? "Mom, you're going to be fine," Alan reassured her as she slowly regained consciousness. Ilani looked up at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and confusion. "Al, what happened?" "It's going to be okay, Mom," Alan said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But don't worry. I'll make sure that officer never does something like that again. He won't get away with this." Ilani didn't fully understand the depth of Alan's anger, but she could see the determination in his eyes. She squeezed his hand weakly, thankful for his support. But deep down, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The officer's cruelty had cut deeper than just the physical pain of the asthma attack, it had wounded her in a way she couldn't quite explain. The worst part? It wasn't just that he hadn't helped her, it was that he had actively made things worse. And Ilani would never forget that. Seeking justice, facing resistance. Days passed since the incident with Officer Cole, but the sting of that moment lingered like a shadow over Ilani and Alan. Though Ilani had physically recovered from the asthma attack, the emotional scars were more difficult to heal. The memory of the officer's sneer, the way he had casually kicked her inhaler into the trash, those images replayed in her mind over and over. The injustice gnawed at her, making her feel powerless. But more than anything, what hurt the most was the feeling of being dehumanized. The officer hadn't seen a woman in distress, a mother in need, he had seen an inconvenience, someone beneath his regard. It wasn't just the officer's actions that disturbed Ilani, it was the wider truth that seemed to surround it. Over the years, she had heard stories of people, particularly people of color, facing similar treatment, brushed aside by those meant to protect and serve. Her own experience now felt like a part of that larger, painful narrative. The anger that bubbled inside her was not just about what happened to her. It was about the way society had normalized such treatment, the way it seemed almost impossible to fight back. But Alan was determined. He had always been protective of his mother, but now, his sense of justice was ignited like never before. The moment he left the hospital, his first thought wasn't just about how to get her home safely, it was how to make sure Officer Cole was held accountable. He would not let this injustice slide. The idea of the officer walking free, his actions unchallenged, filled him with fury. He could feel the weight of the responsibility, if not for his own sake, then for his mother's. Alan wasn't naive. He knew the odds were against them. Officer Cole was a member of the police force, a system that often protected its own. But Alan had always been someone who believed in the power of standing up for what was right. He had seen his mother endure so much in her life, and he wouldn't allow this cruelty to be brushed under the rug. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that something bigger was at play. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a symptom of a larger issue that had festered for far too long. Ilani was reluctant at first. She didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to draw more attention to herself. She had lived a quiet life, and confronting the police was never something she had imagined herself doing. But Alan wouldn't let her back down. Together, they gathered their courage and reached out to an attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. The attorney listened to their story, his expression serious, and after a brief pause, he agreed to take on their case. Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, the attorney said, leaning forward in his office chair. This case is going to be tough. The police are notoriously hard to challenge, especially when they have no direct evidence to support your claims. But if we proceed, we'll be fighting not only for justice for you but for accountability in the system. You'll have to be prepared for what lies ahead. Ilani and Alan nodded. They knew it wouldn't be easy. But they were determined. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. Alan couldn't sleep at night, constantly going over every detail in his mind. He didn't want to forget anything, the way the officer had treated his mother, the words he had spoken, the cruelty in his actions. He began talking to anyone who would listen, telling them about the officer's behavior. Some people were sympathetic, while others were dismissive. A few of the neighbors had seen the incident from a distance, but none had been close enough to provide solid testimony. Ilani's condition had been too severe for anyone to take video, and there were no surveillance cameras on that stretch of road. But Alan's frustration didn't subside. He started organizing protests, small gatherings of people who had been inspired by his story. He knew that in order to hold Officer Cole accountable, he needed to shine a light on the bigger issue, police brutality, systemic injustice, and how those in positions of power often disregarded the lives of marginalized individuals. The media began to take notice. What started as a small story in the local newspaper soon spread to television networks, social media, and online news outlets. Alan was becoming the face of the movement, and the pressure on the police force began to grow. Yet, despite all the publicity, the department remained steadfast. The lack of physical evidence meant that the case was tenuous at best. And as much as the public rallied behind Ilani and Alan, the system seemed to favor Officer Cole. The day of the court hearing arrived, and both mother and son found themselves standing before a judge, facing a battle that would test their resolve. The courtroom was filled with tension. Ilani, in her best dress, sat beside Alan, who was holding her hand tightly. They were both anxious, but there was a quiet strength that radiated from them. This wasn't just about them, it was about something much larger. Officer Cole was there too, his smug demeanor almost unrecognizable in the formal suit he wore. He sat across from them, his lawyer by his side, his eyes narrowed with a sense of indifference. He knew that his job and reputation were on the line, but it was clear that he believed he would come out unscathed. The courtroom was a place he had become familiar with, having seen many cases dismissed in his favor. The hearing began with the prosecution presenting their case. Though the evidence was weak, they argued that Officer Cole had acted recklessly, placing Ilani's life at risk. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Officer Cole had no ill intentions and that there was no direct proof of any harm caused. The key piece of evidence, the inhaler, was irretrievable, buried deep within a trash can. The case became a tug of war, with each side presenting their narrative. As the days of deliberation stretched on, it became painfully clear that the court was unlikely to side with them. Officer Cole's lawyer had presented a strong defense, and the judge seemed swayed by the technicalities of the case. Even though the public was on their side, the system was failing them. With no solid evidence and no clear-cut witness testimony, the Roberts family felt like their fight was slipping through their fingers. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was a blow that nearly shattered their spirits. The case was dismissed. The judge ruled that there was not enough evidence to support the claim of officer misconduct. The room fell silent as Ilani and Alan exchanged a look of disbelief. The victory they had hoped for, the justice they so desperately needed, was slipping away. And yet, as they walked out of the courtroom, the words of the judge still echoing in their minds, they saw Officer Cole standing near the door. He shot them a mocking smile, as if to say, "You tried, but you failed. Justice isn't for people like you," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You can't win against the system. You never could." Those words stung more than any physical injury. Ilani could feel the rage building inside her son. She had hoped the court would offer a sense of closure, but now, she realized that the battle was far from over. This wasn't just about winning in court, it was about fighting for something bigger, something that would require more than just legal action. Alan clenched his fists, his eyes hardening with a resolve that scared even him. He didn't care what it took now. He would make sure Officer Cole would answer for his actions. It wasn't just about justice for his mother anymore, it was about something far more important. He was ready to do whatever it took. A father's worst nightmare. The events of the past few weeks had left Officer Cole feeling uneasy. On the outside, his demeanor remained the same, calm, composed, and utterly indifferent to the mounting pressure from the media and the public. But privately, a gnawing feeling of discomfort had taken root in his chest. He had faced accusations before, but nothing like this. This case had become personal for many, particularly for the family of the woman he had so callously brushed aside. Even though the court had cleared him of any wrongdoing, Officer Cole couldn't shake the feeling that he was under a microscope now, his every action scrutinized. He had made it through the trial unscathed, but something in the back of his mind told him that this would not be the end of it. The strain of the case weighed heavily on him. The one certain sense of control he had over his life was slipping. It seemed like every time he went out, he was confronted with reminders of the incident, whether it was the protesters outside his precinct or the constant media coverage. It felt like the world was closing in around him, and he couldn't escape the shadow of the woman in the wheelchair or her furious son, Alan. But on this particular evening, Officer Cole tried to push those worries aside. He had just finished a long shift and was looking forward to spending some time with his family. He picked up his 10-year-old daughter, Sarah, from school, a routine that had become an anchor for him in the midst of all the chaos. Sarah had always been a bright, cheerful child, someone who could make him laugh even on his darkest days. But today, something was different. As Sarah climbed into the car, she seemed off. She had been coughing intermittently during the day, and although he had noticed it earlier, he didn't think much of it. It wasn't uncommon for children to catch colds, especially during the changing seasons. However, today, her cough was deeper, more persistent. She kept rubbing at her throat, a concerned expression on her face. "Dad, I don't feel too well," Sarah said quietly, her voice raspy. "I think I have a cold." Officer Cole glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but he wasn't overly concerned. She had been through a cold before, and the school nurse had reassured him earlier that it was nothing serious. "Don't worry, sweetheart," he said, trying to sound casual. "We'll get you some medicine when we get home. You'll be fine." But as the night wore on, Sarah's condition worsened. She became more lethargic, her energy drained, and her fever spiked. The coughing continued, this time accompanied by a strange wheezing sound that sent a pang of unease through his chest. Cole was a man who prided himself on being able to remain calm in difficult situations, but something about this felt different, more urgent. He had dealt with emergencies before, but this wasn't a simple case of a cold. Something was wrong. "Dad, I'm cold," Sarah said weakly, pulling the blankets closer around herself on the couch. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I don't want to go to sleep." Cole's heart clenched. He rubbed her back soothingly, but inside, panic was beginning to take root. Something about the way she looked, pale, sweating, trembling, told him that this wasn't just a cold. "You're going to be okay," he reassured her, though the words felt hollow. He grabbed the thermometer and checked her temperature, finding that it was dangerously high. Cole had never been the type to panic easily, but he couldn't deny the dread that was building in his chest. He called the pediatrician's office, but by the time they called him back, it was too late. Sarah's condition had already taken a drastic turn for the worse. She was no longer able to sit up or even speak coherently. Her cough was violent, and with every hack, it sounded like her lungs were being torn apart. In a state of sheer panic, Cole rushed Sarah to the emergency room. The doctors moved quickly, trying to assess her condition. They hooked her up to N4 and administered fluids to bring down the fever. But as the night wore on, Sarah's condition only worsened. Her coughing fits grew more intense, her breathing labored. The doctor pulled Cole aside, his face grim. "I'm sorry," the doctor said, his voice heavy with regret. "But it looks like your daughter has been poisoned." The words hit Cole like a punch to the gut. Poisoned? How was that possible? He had been with Sarah all day, and there had been nothing out of the ordinary. No strange food, no drinks, nothing unusual in her environment. But the tests were clear, the toxins in her system were unlike anything the doctors had seen. They were a form of neurotoxin, and they had already started attacking her organs. "We've never seen anything like this," the doctor continued. "The toxins are too strong. We don't have a cure for this." Cole's world crumbled around him. He felt as though the ground beneath his feet had disappeared, and he was free-falling into a dark abyss. His daughter, his little girl, was dying, and he had no idea how or why it was happening. "Can you help her?" Cole asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor shook his head. "We're doing everything we can. But at this stage, there's not much more we can do. The toxins have already spread too far." Cole's mind raced. Poisoned. How could this have happened? His thoughts turned to everything Sarah had eaten or touched that day. He replayed every moment of the afternoon in his head, but nothing made sense. It was as if some invisible hand had reached into his life and ripped everything away. And then it hit him, an unsettling, chilling thought. The thought of someone intentionally harming his daughter. The idea seemed impossible, but it made a dark sort of sense. There had been so much turmoil in his life recently. The case with Ilani, the accusations, the media frenzy. Officer Cole had made enemies, not just among the protesters but potentially within his own department. Was there someone out there who wanted to make him pay for his actions? Or was this some sort of twisted coincidence? As Sarah's condition worsened, Cole's mind raced with more questions than answers. Was someone targeting him? Was there a connection to the trial? And if so, who could have done this? The idea of his daughter being the victim of a targeted attack filled him with an anger so raw and primal, it consumed him. The possibility that his own actions had inadvertently caused this, that the weight of his past cruelty had come back to haunt him, was almost too much to bear. That night, Cole sat by Sarah's bedside, her small hand weakly grasping his own. Her breathing had become shallow, and the doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. The thought of losing her, of never seeing her smile again, of never hearing her laughter, was unbearable. As the hours passed, Cole's emotions churned. The fury, the helplessness, the guilt. He knew he had wronged Alani, and he had done so without any real remorse. Now, standing on the precipice of losing the one person he loved more than anything in the world, he was forced to confront the weight of his past actions. The injustice he had inflicted on Alani, her suffering, her pain, her son's rage, it had all come full circle. His decisions, his careless actions, had led to this moment. "Please, God," he whispered, his voice broken. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But no answer came. The room was silent, save for the sound of Sarah's labored breathing. Cole's thoughts were consumed by one question: was this his punishment for what he had done? Had his past finally caught up with him? As Sarah's fever spiked again, her body trembling under the weight of the toxins, Officer Cole realized that this was no longer just a battle for his daughter's life, it was a battle for his own soul. And in the midst of the chaos, he found himself questioning everything he had ever believed in. His world was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The bitter truth. The days following Sarah's sudden decline felt like an eternity for Officer Cole. Each hour was a battle, each breath she took, or failed to take, reminding him of the fragility of life. The doctors had done everything they could, but as time wore on, it became painfully clear that Sarah was slipping further away from him. The toxin was relentless, poisoning her body in ways the medical team couldn't counter. Every night, Cole sat by her bedside, holding her tiny hand in his, desperately praying for a miracle that never came. His mind, once sharp and confident, now felt clouded with confusion and guilt. He thought back to his actions with Alani, his callous dismissal of her suffering, the sneer that had twisted his face as he kicked her inhaler into the trash. Had it all come back to haunt him? Had his indifference to the pain of others now summoned a cruel retribution, targeting the one person he loved most in the world? But as the days passed, a darker, more unsettling realization began to form in his mind. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't some cosmic payback for his actions toward Alani. No, it was more sinister than that. It had to be. There was no way that Sarah's condition could deteriorate so rapidly without someone being responsible for it. Someone had deliberately poisoned her. The question was who? Cole had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the signs of deliberate harm. He had seen victims of assault, of poisoning, and even of betrayal. And now, with every new hour that Sarah's life hung in the balance, he couldn't ignore the possibility that someone had intentionally targeted him, seeking revenge for what he had done to Alani and her family. He had made enemies, after all. The protesters, the media, the anonymous social media accounts all calling for his resignation. What if this wasn't just a reaction to his actions with Alani, it was part of a larger scheme to bring him to his knees? The thought consumed him. It was hard to reconcile the image of a father, so desperate to save his child, with the knowledge that he was, in some way, the architect of his own downfall. But somewhere, deep down, Cole began to suspect that it wasn't just his past actions with Alani that had put him here. It was his very nature, the arrogance, the lack of empathy, the cold detachment with which he had treated people for so long. He had never seen the humanity in others, and now he was being forced to face the consequences. Alan's face, the fiery anger in his eyes, the relentless pursuit of justice for his mother, flashed through his mind. Officer Cole had dismissed him, laughed in his face, and humiliated him. But Alan wasn't just some angry son looking for retribution. He had become the face of a movement, a rallying cry for people who had suffered at the hands of officers like Cole, who thought they could act with impunity. And that was the bitter truth that Cole had to face: he wasn't above the law. He wasn't invincible. His actions had consequences. And now, those consequences had come home to roost. Every moment he spent in the hospital room, watching Sarah's condition deteriorate, was a reminder of his failures. He had failed as a father. He had failed as an officer. And now, it felt like he was failing as a human being. It was in this broken state of mind that he found himself sitting in a small, dimly lit office, meeting with his internal affairs team. The weight of the recent events hung heavily in the room. Cole had been summoned to answer for his conduct during the incident with Ilani. The pressure had mounted to the point where the department could no longer ignore the allegations against him. It was no longer just about a single, isolated incident, it was about his entire career, his conduct, and the way his actions had affected the community he had sworn to protect. "I've been following your case, Officer Cole," one of the investigators began, her tone clinical and detached. "And I must say, we've had several complaints regarding your behavior in recent months. There have been reports from citizens, internal reports, even video footage of you mishandling situations on duty." Cole's stomach twisted. He had anticipated the conversation, but hearing it out loud was a different matter entirely. It felt like every misstep, every failure, was being thrown back in his face. "I'm aware of the accusations," Cole replied, his voice tight, betraying none of the inner turmoil he was feeling. "But I did nothing wrong. I followed protocol." "Protocol," the investigator repeated, leaning forward. "Is kicking a woman's inhaler into a trash can following protocol? Is mocking a woman in distress protocol? You've been trained to handle situations like that with compassion, Officer Cole, not cruelty." Cole swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the familiar anger flaring. But he forced himself to stay calm. He had to play this carefully. He had to keep his job, especially now. "I didn't harm her," Cole said, his voice low, but firm. "I didn't mean to harm her. It was a mistake." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "A mistake," she repeated. "This wasn't just a mistake, officer. You've built a pattern of disregard for the well-being of others. Your actions have consequences. And now we're facing a situation where your personal history with a member of the public is potentially linked to a much bigger incident. Your daughter's life is on the line." Cole's heart skipped a beat. The mention of Sarah, of his daughter, caught him off guard. The reality of his situation, his child in danger, his career unraveling, hit him like a punch to the gut. He felt a rush of emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks, fear, anger, guilt, all swirling together. "Don't bring her into this," Cole snapped, the raw edge of desperation evident in his voice. The investigator didn't flinch. "I'm not the one who brought her into this, officer. You did. You made the choices that put you here, and now, you'll have to face the consequences." A wave of helplessness crashed over him. He knew she was right. He had brought this all upon himself, and now he would have to deal with the fallout. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just about his mistakes, it was about something more calculated, more sinister. Someone had targeted him, had poisoned his daughter, and he had no idea who or why. As the meeting concluded, Cole walked out of the office feeling more lost than ever. The door slammed shut behind him with a finality that seemed to echo in his mind. His career, his reputation, and his family were on the line. And in that moment, Officer Cole realized that he had crossed a line that had been invisible to him until now. It was no longer just about right and wrong, about upholding the law. It was about surviving the consequences of his own actions, facing the realization that he could no longer escape the wreckage he had caused. As he sat alone in his car outside the precinct, his mind racing, he made a decision. He would do whatever it took to find the person responsible for poisoning Sarah. He would find them, confront them, and bring them to justice, no matter the cost. But in doing so, he knew he was making a dangerous choice. He was stepping into a fight that was bigger than just his family, a fight that could destroy him. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. Sarah's life was slipping away, and he would not allow anyone to take her from him. He had no choice but to fight back, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had left. The battle for his daughter's survival had begun. And Officer Cole would stop at nothing to win it. The breaking point. As the days dragged on, Officer Cole's life was no longer defined by routine, by patrols or paperwork or brief moments of peace. No, now his world revolved around one singular, agonizing focus: Sarah. His little girl, barely 10 years old, was clinging to life by the thinnest thread. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity, each one filled with the weight of guilt, fear, and an overwhelming sense of impending loss. He couldn't sit idle in that sterile hospital room any longer. The doctors had done everything they could, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Sarah was fading. The toxins in her system were irreversible. Cole had heard the words before, "We're doing all we can." But each time, they rang hollow. There was no cure for what was happening to his daughter. There was no magic remedy, no quick fix. She was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The sense of helplessness was like a heavy, suffocating blanket, wrapping itself around his chest, making it harder to breathe. But even through the haze of despair, something inside him snapped. The fear, the guilt, the frustration, it all mixed together into a searing ball of rage. He had to do something. He couldn't sit here, powerless, while the person he loved most in the world was torn from him. The situation with Alani, with the case that had caused his downfall, suddenly felt like a distant memory. It was no longer just about his career or the mistakes he had made, it was about survival, about revenge, about ensuring that his daughter didn't die in vain. Cole had spent years cultivating a reputation of cold indifference, a persona that allowed him to do his job without getting emotionally involved. But now, that same detachment had become his prison. He had ignored the lives of others for so long, and now he was trapped by his own apathy. He had dismissed Ilani, not seen her as a human being, only as a problem, as a distraction. And now, it was his daughter who was paying the price for that indifference. Alan's face haunted him. The anger in Alan's eyes when he had confronted him in the courtroom, the fury that had burned in his voice as he demanded justice for his mother, it was all so clear now. Cole had underestimated Alan's resolve, had dismissed his plea for justice as nothing more than a son's anger. But Alan wasn't just angry. He was a man driven by a sense of purpose, by the belief that right and wrong mattered. And Cole had never understood that, until now. As he sat by Sarah's bedside, staring at her pale face, the anger inside him flared again. The thought that someone, anyone, could harm his little girl, poison her, just because of something he had done to Ilani, was unbearable. Who could be so cruel, so heartless? Could it really have been Alan, seeking revenge for what had happened to his mother? Or was it someone else entirely? He didn't know, but he was sure of one thing: whoever had done this would pay. It wasn't just about getting justice anymore. It wasn't just about righting the wrongs that had been done. No, now it was personal. The stakes were higher than ever before. It wasn't enough to simply punish the guilty. Officer Cole needed to make them suffer. He needed to feel the same kind of anguish he was enduring. It was the only way he could justify what was happening to his daughter. It was the only way he could claw his way out of the pit of despair he had dug himself into. Days blurred into nights, and every minute that passed felt like a countdown to Sarah's death. The hospital room, once a place of hope, now felt suffocating. Every breath Sarah took sounded like a struggle, each rasping inhalation a painful reminder of the toxins eating away at her. Cole had no idea how much time they had left. Hours, maybe days. He couldn't bear to think about it. Then, one night, something changed. Sarah woke up, her small eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, she was coherent. She looked at her father, and the faintest glimmer of recognition passed through her fevered gaze. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Daddy, I'm scared." The words hit Cole like a punch to the gut. His throat tightened, and for the first time in days, he felt something raw and human. He leaned down beside her, brushing the damp hair from her forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm right here. You're not alone." Sarah managed a small smile, the effort clearly exhausting her. But then, her face clouded with confusion, her brows furrowing slightly. "Daddy, what happened to me?" she asked. "Why can't I breathe right? Why do I feel so sick?" Cole swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. He had no answers for her, no comfort to offer. The truth was too painful to bear. But he didn't want her to feel alone. Not now. Not when she needed him most. "You're going to be okay, honey," he lied, though he knew deep down it was no longer possible. "We're going to get through this." But even as he spoke the words, a voice inside him was screaming in the back of his mind, "No, we're not. She's not going to make it. And I'm responsible." The guilt threatened to consume him once again. He had made so many mistakes, had he really come this far only to lose his daughter? It was too much to bear. In the quiet moments that followed, Cole's thoughts turned inward. He had built this life, this career, on control, on power, on maintaining order. But now, with Sarah's life hanging in the balance, all of that felt meaningless. There was no control here. There was no order. There was only chaos. Only fear. The door to the room opened quietly, and Cole's partner, Officer Reyes, stepped in. Reyes had been a constant presence in his life for years, someone he could rely on, someone who had always had his back. But now, even Reyes seemed different. His eyes were heavy with concern, and there was something in his gaze that made Cole uneasy. "You holding up okay, Cole?" Reyes asked, his voice gentle but strained. Cole nodded, though the truth was far from it. He was falling apart, and he knew it. But he couldn't let anyone see it, not even Reyes. He had always been the one who held it together. The one who was unflappable. And now that facade was crumbling. "I'm fine," Cole said, his voice low and distant. Just waiting." Reyes glanced at Sarah, then back at Cole. His expression softened, but there was an edge of tension in his voice. "I heard the news," Reyes said quietly. "About Alani. The trial, the way it went down. I know you've been dealing with a lot. And now, with Sarah." Cole's jaw tightened. He knew where this was heading. Reyes wasn't asking about Sarah. Reyes was asking about him. Asking if he had learned anything from this. Asking if he was finally going to own up to his mistakes. "It's not about that anymore," Cole muttered. "It's about her. It's about my daughter." Reyes sighed, looking away for a moment. Then he placed a hand on Cole's shoulder. "I know, man. But you can't keep running from this. From what happened. From what you did to her, to Alani. It's not just going to go away. No matter how much you wish it would." Cole's eyes flashed with anger, but he swallowed it down. He didn't want to hear this. Not now. Not when his world was falling apart. But Reyes was right, as much as it pained him to admit it. He couldn't escape his actions. Not this time. "I don't know how to fix this," Cole whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't even know if I can fix it." Reyes' grip on his shoulder tightened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he just stood there, silently supporting him as Sarah's soft breaths filled the room. Cole's mind was spinning. He was at a breaking point. But there was one thing he knew for sure: no matter what happened next, no matter how much he had to sacrifice, he wasn't going to let his daughter die in vain. He was going to find the person who had poisoned her, and he was going to make them pay. He would find a way to make things right, even if it meant losing everything. A quiet stroll gone wrong. The early autumn morning was crisp and clear, the sunlight filtering through the golden leaves that fluttered lazily from the trees. A gentle breeze played through the branches, carrying the earthy scent of the changing season. Ilani Roberts, a 65-year-old black woman, had lived in this quiet neighborhood for over 3 decades, and today, she decided to take a moment for herself. Her body, though seasoned with age, still yearned for the fresh air and peaceful solitude the morning offered. Despite the limitations her asthma had imposed on her for years, she refused to let it keep her from living. With a determined glint in her eye, she wheeled herself down the familiar path of her street, pushing herself with careful, measured movements. Though she had learned to manage her condition for years, there were still moments when her breath caught in her chest. She had kept herself as active as she could, walking with her dog, visiting friends, spending time in her garden, but on this particular morning, as she pushed herself along the sidewalk, a sudden constriction gripped her lungs, stealing her breath away. The sensation was immediate and frightening. Ilani had felt the onset of asthma attacks before, but this time, the tightening in her chest was different. It was as though an invisible hand had wrapped around her ribs, squeezing harder with every shallow breath. She instinctively reached for her bag, where she knew her inhaler rested, tucked inside a small pocket. But her hands, though practiced in their motions, trembled more than usual, an unsettling sign that she was losing control of the situation. The bag was heavy, and as she fumbled to unzip it, it slipped from her lap and tumbled to the ground, its contents scattering across the asphalt. Keys, a small wallet, a half-empty water bottle, and an old photograph of her late husband spilled out onto the street. Ilani cursed under her breath, panic beginning to set in. Her chest tightened further, her breath shallow and gasping, and her once steady hands now betrayed her. Her fingers grazed over the objects, but she couldn't grasp them firmly enough. Her inhaler was nowhere in sight. The world around her started to blur, and her vision became clouded as she leaned forward, attempting to reach the fallen items. The effort sent a wave of dizziness crashing over her. She had to find it. The inhaler was her only chance, her only lifeline in that moment. But no matter how much she tried, it was as though her body was betraying her. She could no longer steady her hands or reach her feet to gather the scattered things. The world was spinning, her breath escaping her in short, panicked bursts. She was falling. "Help," she whispered, though the words felt like they didn't belong to her. "Please, help me." Her body gave in, and she slid from the wheelchair, collapsing onto the hard pavement. The ground felt cold beneath her as her body crumpled. The terror that gripped her chest intensified as she gasped for air, each breath a battle she was losing. "I can't breathe," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Her hand reached desperately for the inhaler, but it was too far away now. Her body shook, her vision darkening. Just as the darkness seemed to take over, a figure appeared in the distance, large, looming against the bright morning light. A man. A police officer. Ilani's heart leapt, relief flooding through her body. She had always trusted the police, believed that they were there to help, to protect. But as the figure drew closer, something in the officer's stride made her hesitate. There was no rush in his movement, no sense of urgency, as though he wasn't rushing to help a woman in distress, but rather walking to deal with some minor inconvenience. The officer's face was still distant, his eyes shaded by the reflection of his sunglasses. Ilani couldn't make out his expression, but she could feel the unsettling presence as he approached. Her vision was still blurry, but she could make out the badge on his chest and the silhouette of his uniform. He seemed to take his time, his boots clicking deliberately against the sidewalk. When the officer finally reached her, Ilani's heart pounded with desperate hope. She was still lying on the street, struggling for air, her body weak and trembling. "Please. I need help. I can't breathe." She gasped, trying to focus on him, but her words were frantic, barely audible. But instead of kneeling down to help, the officer stood there, looking down at her with a cold, detached gaze. He glanced at the inhaler lying just out of reach, and his lips curled into a small, mocking smile. Ilani felt a strange sense of confusion, unsure of what was happening. This man was a symbol of authority, someone who was supposed to care, to act. Yet, his demeanor felt entirely different. The officer bent down, picked up the inhaler from the ground, and examined it with a sneer. His eyes scanned the small device before he flicked it dismissively, as though it were a worthless object. "Look at this," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Ilani to hear. "Another junkie, thinking they can fix everything with this." His tone was laced with mockery. Ilani's blood ran cold. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The officer wasn't concerned about her health, wasn't even considering the possibility that she was in distress. He was judging her, dismissing her, treating her as if she were less than human. In one swift motion, the officer kicked the inhaler into the trash can nearby, his face twisting into a smirk. The action felt as if it were in slow motion. Ilani reached forward, her hand outstretched, but it was futile. The inhaler was gone, lost to the refuse. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her chest tightened with each passing second, each breath more difficult than the last. Her body collapsed in on itself, and she could feel her vision dimming, the world around her becoming distant. The officer's laughter echoed as he turned to leave, clearly unconcerned with the woman lying helpless on the ground. "No point in you using this," he muttered, his words taunting, as if this was all just some cruel joke to him. "Please, help me," Ilani's voice was nothing more than a rasp. She reached her hand out toward him, but it was too late. The officer had already walked away, his footsteps growing fainter and fainter with each passing second. "Mom!" A voice shattered the silence. An all-too-familiar voice that Ilani hadn't realized she'd been yearning for. Alan, her 35-year-old son, came running around the corner, panic written all over his face. "Mom, oh my God!" Alan's hands shook as he knelt beside her, gathering her frail body into his arms. "Stay with me, please. Don't leave me, Mom." Ilani could barely lift her head, her vision clouded by dizziness. But she could feel her son's strong arms around her, his warmth, his presence. In her fogged state, she found a small amount of comfort in his touch, but she was still so terrified. "I can't breathe, Al," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. She was failing. The fear gripped her heart. Was she going to die here, abandoned by the very people meant to protect her? With determination burning in his eyes, Alan scooped her up from the ground and rushed her to the car. He didn't care about anything else, his mind focused entirely on getting her help, getting her to safety. They reached the hospital in record time, Alan barely noticing the traffic or the red lights as he sped through the streets. The doctors moved quickly to stabilize Ilani, applying oxygen and administering the necessary treatments to reverse the effects of the asthma attack. But as they worked, Alan stood off to the side, seething with anger, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. How could someone, an officer of the law, no less, treat his mother like that? How could he be so callous, so utterly devoid of compassion? Alan didn't know it yet, but the seed of something darker was being planted in his heart. This was not something he would let go. This was not something that would simply fade with time. The injustice of it burned in him, and as his mother slowly regained consciousness, looking up at him with confused, tearful eyes, Alan made a silent promise: "I will make this right. I will make them see you." Ilani looked up at him weakly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Al. What happened? I don't understand." "I'm here, Mom. You're going to be okay," Alan reassured her softly, though his heart was heavy with the weight of the anger that was already beginning to rise in him. And so, a quiet, bitter seed was sown. This would not end here. What had happened today was only the beginning.